time for us to check back in with Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to buy this wonderful, wonderful book, please visit watermelonhillbook.com. The Great Horseshoe Game. Whenever some relatives or friends came to spend the day with us on the hill, if it wasn't raining or too cold, a horseshoe game was sure to start up. We had horses but not much money, so we used real horseshoes, not the regulation ones you may be familiar with. Real horseshoes were much smaller than regulation shoes and curved in at the tips instead of straight, making it much more difficult to make a ringer, so we counted 5 points for a ringer instead of 3 and counted 3 for a leaner. These horseshoe games sometimes turned into regular tournaments that lasted all day and into the edge of dark. I remember times we put tinfoil on the top of the stakes to make them more visible so we wouldn't have to quit. The ultimate effort to prolong the game had to be a time or two when we caught lightning bugs and smeared them on the stakes to make them glow in the dark. When we had a chance at some entertainment, we didn't want to waste it. I know you're probably saying, why didn't they just set up some floodlights if they wanted to play that bad? Well, if we could have afforded floodlights, we could probably have bought regulation shoes. It was surprising how good some people could get with those small shoes, and a lot of ringers were made, but not many by me, which makes the following all the more amazing. Sunday, September 28, 1975, was the date which will go down in history, at least my history, as the Great Horseshoe Game. This was after I had grown up and had a family of my own, and while we were home for a vacation. My sisters May and Edna and my brother Jack were also there, along with my Aunt Vangie and my cousin Don Maynard. Naturally, we started a horseshoe game. Don had brought some regulation shoes with him, so we used them. Over the years since I moved away from Watermelon Hill, I probably hadn't played horseshoes more than once every year or two, and neither had any of the others. We were all sadly out of practice and had never used regulation shoes but a few times. We played partners with my brother Jack pitching against me and my sister May pitching against Don. If there hadn't been witnesses, no one would have believed what happened that day. Jack and I had always been mediocre players at best, but that day, something magical happened. For some reason, after just a few pitches, both Jack and I started throwing ringers. Normally, we might have thrown a ringer once every game or two at best, but that day we were charmed. We could literally not miss. Jack would throw 2 ringers, and I would throw 2 on top of them. Or I would throw 2, and he would throw 2 on top of mine. It was unbelievable, and no one was more astonished than Jack and I. I knew I was playing way over my head, but Jack thought I was really that good and was just amazed that he was keeping up with me. He had no idea that I was feeling the same way. I didn't know what had come over me, still don't. The most unbelievable part was that it didn't just last for a few pitches, but game after game, all through the afternoon. I don't know about Jack, but after a while, my fingers started to rub raw. It hurt when I pitched, but I still couldn't miss. I would estimate very conservatively that we threw ringers on 75% of our pitches. I don't know who won the most games, and I doubt if Jack does either. That wasn't important. We were just enjoying our newfound expertise too much to worry about it. Over the years, Jack and I have both hoped we could repeat our miraculous performance, but we never have. It was a one-day flash in the pan. The Caudills have a family reunion every 2 years, and we always pitch horseshoes, but it never happens. We are both just as mediocre as we always were. What must the odds be for 2 very average players to become professional caliber while playing against each other on the same day? They have to be astronomical. That day, if Jack and I had been playing partners, I don't think anyone, anywhere, could have beaten us. To this day, whenever any of the participants or observers of that day's games are together and one mentions to another something about the horseshoe game, we know right away what game is being referred to. The Great Horseshoe Game, of course. There will never be another like it. at least not in my life. Going back home. Being the youngest of 6 children and being 8 years younger than my nearest brother, by the time I was 10, I was virtually an only child. Most of my brothers and sisters were married by that time, and all had moved away from home. Lawrence was married and living in Massachusetts. Curtis married and moved to Ohio to become a plastering contractor. My 2 sisters, Leela Mae and Edna, got married and moved to Ohio, and the last brother, Jack, joined the Army. Whenever any of the older brothers or sisters came back to Watermelon Hill to visit, they seemed almost like celebrities to me. After all, they weren't just living away from home, they weren't even living in Kentucky. They usually had nice cars, or sometimes even new cars, nice clothes. They had traveled and would tell me about places and things I had only read about. They told about 4-lane roads, cloverleaf intersections, and all sorts of things I had never seen. It was exciting. Of course, when our favorite aunts, uncles, and cousins visited, it was an event too. Some of them always seemed to time their visit to coincide with the time that their favorite fruit was due to be ripe. For some it was apples, others watermelons or blackberries. When the grapes were getting ripe, we always knew we could expect a visit from my cousin Anna Lee. She loved our Concord grapes. After I became an only child, with 2 sisters and 3 brothers, I looked forward even more to their visits. Sometimes they would take me to the movies, which I hardly ever got to do until I became a teenager and was earning some money of my own. It didn't matter though, I was just happy to have some of them home. It was lonely with only Mom and Dad at home after being used to having brothers and sisters around. We all had our favorite places around the kitchen table when we were growing up, and as we grew up at different times, some of the older kids' places were also the younger kids' places, and it was further complicated when grandchildren were added. If a family came home, the grandchildren had their favorite seats too. When more than one family came home at the same time, there was always competition for the favorite seat. By that time, though, age didn't automatically win. It was first come, first served, with good-natured races to the table. The only places never in dispute were Mom's and Dad's. They always sat on the right side of the table, with Mom closest to the stove, because she was always getting up to refill a bowl of food or something. I don't think I ever saw her sit through an entire meal without getting up several times. Finally, I left home too. After I graduated from high school in 1960, I attended college for a year, worked for a year, then joined the Army in June of 1962. While I was in the Army, we had a small family reunion, just the kids and their families. I was not married yet, so I came alone. The reunion was great, but the trip to get there was a journey from hell. My brother Curtis and his family lived in Clearwater, Florida, and my brother Jack and his wife lived near Curtis, so they drove along together to pick me up at a missile base in South Georgia. Before they even got out of Florida, Curtis had a flat on his station wagon. They were traveling with their kids, so that meant unloading all the luggage, boxes, toys, etc., so they could get the spare out from under the floor. They were running late then, so it was about 1 a.m. when they arrived at my Army base, and Jack promptly dropped his front wheel over the edge of a culvert while turning into the parking lot. The A-frame was damaged, and nothing could be done in Sylvester, Georgia at that time of night, so we limped along at about 40 miles per hour all the way to Atlanta, where we stopped the next morning to get it repaired. That shot the whole day, and we didn't get back on the road until about 7 p.m. that night. I was riding with Jack, and that night he got a killer migraine headache, so I drove most of the rest of the way. The night passed uneventfully, just trying to stay awake. The next morning we were less than 70 miles from home, coming down a mountain when Curtis started to lose his brakes. Luckily, we were coming into a small town at the base of the mountain before they went out completely, so he slowly coasted into a garage. He had just had a brake job before he left Florida and couldn't imagine what was wrong. When they pulled the wheel off, there was no brake lining left. A handful of powder fell out. I don't know if the brake was adjusted too tight or if it was just defective, but none of us had ever seen anything like it. By the time we got home, what should have been approximately a 22-hour trip, this was before interstate highways, had taken about 40 hours, plus the fact that we had been up all the day before. We were stupid not to have stopped, but we were all anxious to get home. One evening while we were home, some of the younger kids started playing hide-and-go-seek, and before we knew it, we had all joined in. We ranged in age from probably 3 to 40, all playing like little kids. The adults were just as enthusiastic as the kids. Mom and Dad kidded us about it, but it was a delightful little trip back to childhood. In the edge of the field in front of the house, we dug a pit in the ground, lined it with large rocks, burned scrap wood in it until there was a bed of ashes, then cooked in it. Bed space was running short in the house, so I slept by the pit under a canvas lean-to with a couple of my brothers. We watched the stars, talked about old times, and it was wonderful. Some years later, at our parents' 50th wedding anniversary, we cleaned the pit out and used it again. That time we cooked most of the food for 90 people in our pit. We cooked a couple of hams, numerous chickens, corn, potatoes, onions, carrots, whatever we could come up with, by double wrapping them in foil and burying them in the ashes. We used a pitchfork to lower them into the ashes and retrieve them. All of the food was delicious. During those Army years, I got home whenever I had the chance, but I didn't always have a car or much money, so I got home the best way I could. One Thanksgiving, I hitchhiked the whole way, nearly 800 miles. That trip was an education. One of the first rides I got took me halfway home, but the guy stopped about every 50 miles for a beer. Another ride I got was with 4 women. Sounds like a young man's dream, but they ranged in age from 8 to 80. My last ride took me on the mountain parkway to within less than 100 miles of home. I was glad to get out of the car because the guy was constantly nipping on a bottle of whiskey, but there I was at 1 a.m. in a little town that was completely asleep. I was dead tired, and after no cars had passed in a half hour, I was about to freeze. I saw a hotel down the block, went in, saw no one, and sacked out on the sofa in the lobby. The next morning, after a few short rides, I called Dad to come take me the last 40 miles. By 1966, I had married and had a son of my own, and 19 months later, a daughter. When we would be home for a visit, Dad never let us sleep very late, so we would come downstairs and let the kids sleep for a while longer. When they woke up, their entrance was always heralded by a series of thump-ump, 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 as they slid their bottoms down the stairs, one step at a time. They had their favorite places at the table, next to my place on the bench, and were new competition for the rest of the family. All of us tried to visit Mom and Dad as often as possible, but in some cases that was only once or twice a year due to the distance involved. At some time or other, most of us lived in Ohio for a while and came home to Kentucky every month or two while we lived there. Invariably, after visiting with the folks for a while and catching up on any family news, I would grab Dad's old .22 rifle and hit the hills. I didn't really intend to shoot anything unless it was just maybe a crow or a knot on a tree for target practice, but it just brought back old times, roaming the hills with Dad's rifle, visiting my favorite places again. After a few hours, all my tension would be melted away, and by the time the weekend was over, I could go back to the city, its traffic and work, with my batteries recharged and ready to tackle life's everyday stress again. In my earliest memories, the city limits sign of Louisa read population 2020. When I graduated from high school in 1960, it read population 2000. When I attended my 40-year class reunion, it still read population 2000. In my lifetime, my hometown has changed very little. The greatest change has come in the last few years with the creation of a beautiful and very large lake outside of town and the construction of a fine-looking marina. I expect this will cause some growth now. Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about the lack of growth. Most residents of Louisa like their small town just fine. Almost everyone knows everyone else. It's a very comfortable and laid-back place. When I graduated from high school, I left town, first for a year of college, then the Army. I never went back to Louisa to live, just to visit my parents and other relatives. I guess I'm more nostalgic these days, but when I went back to my 40-year class reunion, I thought, you know, this wouldn't be a bad place to live. It was like I was seeing the town for the first time and beginning to appreciate it for the first time in a lot of years. Opportunities around Louisa are better these days, but as I was growing up in the 40s and 50s, when you finished high school, if you finished high school, most people left town. Some went to college, some went into the service, and the rest went to Ohio or Michigan to find work. You could stand on a street corner in Louisa any weekend back then and see more Ohio and Michigan license plates than Kentucky. The Big Sandy News, Louisa's weekly and only paper, even ran articles about who was back in town and who they were visiting. People who had left town to find work came home to visit relatives on the weekend and show off their new car to the folks back home. My brothers and sisters did the same thing and always washed and polished their cars to perfection before they went to cruise Louisa. After I got a car of my own, I also tried to keep it clean to go to town or when I had a date. That was harder than it may seem. After cleaning the car spick and span, I still had to get down off the hill with it before I got to a paved road. I would creep down the hill trying to miss all the mud puddles and the ones I couldn't miss. I went through so slow that there would be no splash. When I was a little boy, I didn't get to go to town very often, so it was exciting when I did. Even if the population was only 2,020, that was a lot of people to me. If I was lucky, I might even get an ice cream cone, a real treat before we had a refrigerator. The only time we could make ice cream was in the winter. We had to break icicles from the rock cliffs to freeze the ice cream with, so an ice cream cone in the middle of summer was a real luxury. Louisa did not have a traffic light when I was growing up, but before I graduated from high school, it had one light and never had any more until recent years at the bypasses around town. There were 2 funeral homes, Young's and Compton's, and 2 department stores, the Louisa Department Store and Ferguson's, 2 hospitals, the Riverview and the General, both very small, 3 or 4 small grocery stores, and a few gas stations. It was sort of like Mayberry, but I don't think our deputy was limited to 1 bullet to carry in his pocket like Barney. We had a Ford, Chevy, Pontiac, and Olds dealer. The Olds dealer also carried Kaiser and Fraser cars, no longer manufactured. There was the corner drugstore next to the Brunswick Hotel and diagonally across the main intersection from Don's Hardware, where I worked for a while the summer after high school for 75 cents an hour. On down the street was the Garden Theater and the Rexall drugstore with its old-fashioned soda fountain, small tables with wire-back chairs, some mounted animals around the top of the wall on a ledge, and a pinball machine by the front door. A popular drink there when I was in high school was a cherry Coke or a cherry smash, leave out the Coke. Then came the scene of my first and only crime. It was soon after I had started riding the bus to school in Louisa in the 7th grade that I entered my life of crime. There was no lunchroom at the high school where the 7th and 8th grades also attended, so we walked down the street and bought our lunch at a restaurant. I had 35 cents a day, which was enough to buy a hamburger and a Coke, with enough left over to buy an occasional nickel candy bar if I had a hot dog instead of a hamburger. Before the restaurants was a 5 and 10 cent store, the crime scene, with all kinds of small items for sale. Sometimes after lunch and before returning to school, I would stop in and look around. One day, for some reason, I stole a package of balloons. I don't know why. It was against everything I had been taught, but I did it. I headed furtively back to school, afraid someone had seen me and was coming behind me to take me to jail. Even after I got safely back to school, I still worried. It was not so much that I was afraid someone would catch me as that my conscience was bothering me. I didn't even open the package of balloons. I resolved to take them back the very next day. That evening, I was very careful that no one at home saw my loot. I was miserable. The next day at lunch, I headed directly back to the scene of the crime to return the balloons. When I went into the store, I was even more afraid that as I was slipping them back, someone would see me and think that I was stealing them. Talk about a tangled web. Well, I did successfully return my ill-gotten gain without getting caught and learned a valuable lesson in the process. I was basically honest and definitely not cut out for a life of crime. Years later, after I was married and had a baby son, I was living in West Carrollton, Ohio, near Dayton, and was on my way to work at NCR early one morning. As I passed through town, I pulled into a bank to make a deposit. There were no ATMs then, so deposits before hours were made in a night depository. I dropped my deposit envelope and was starting to pull away when I realized that I hadn't heard the distinctive sound of the envelope sliding down the chute, then dropping inside. I backed up, opened the slot, reached in, and to my surprise, pulled out a fistful of deposit envelopes. I could have pulled out several more fistfuls if I had wanted. Now, those were my beginning years with NCR. I was still an apprentice, making very little money, with a wife and son to support. At the time, I could have really used some extra money. Despite my basically honest nature, I'll admit that I looked around and up and down the street. There was not a living soul moving in that town at 7 a.m. I sat there for a minute, then said, "Nope, can't do it." I stuffed all the deposits but mine as far back down the slot as I could and called the bank after I got to work to explain to them. Evidently, my parents' teachings did some good. Further on down the street was a Louisa landmark for most of my life, Ern's Newsstand. It was run by Ern Compton, a blind man, and in his later years by his son Ben. It was just a tiny wood frame room built right on the sidewalk next to the curb. They later opened a new, larger store further down the street. Just past Ern's was Rip's Restaurant, then the Hamburger Inn. Rip's was the nicest restaurant in town at the time. In the very back was a little cubby hole you had to stoop down to enter. It had a table with benches. You had to squeeze to get in. It was hot and uncomfortable, but was a favorite place for school kids to eat lunch. Across the street was Buttermilk's pool room, where many classes of boys from the high school spent their spare time and money. It was a hangout for the local boys, the better pool players in town, and the occasional hustler passing through. I learned to shoot pool there, too. The Garden Theater was about the only entertainment in town if you didn't shoot pool. It was very reasonable. Through the 50s, admission was still 15 cents for students. On Saturday, you really got your money's worth. Usually a double feature, either a Western or Tarzan or some other adventure movie that would appeal to kids, a newsreel, coming attractions, at least one cartoon, sometimes two, and a serial, a nail-biting cliffhanger that was continued from one week to the next to entice you to come back. You could spend most of the day there for 15 cents. The theater finally closed and became the Western Auto Store. The last time I was in Louisa, it was a NASCAR memorabilia store. Every town, no matter how small, has a few characters, and Louisa was no exception. There was one man I never heard called anything but Pee-wee. He was about 5'5", sort of skinny and slightly hunched over, always wearing a baseball cap. He was our unofficial train greeter. Never was there a time when I was in town and there was a train coming through that Pee-wee wasn't somewhere near the depot with his watch in hand, checking to see if it was on time. I don't know how he kept up with the schedules, but it didn't matter if it was a passenger train making a stop or a freight just passing through. He would be there. One man who lived out in the country was known to regularly buy dog and cat food, though everyone claimed that he had no pets and was just poor. or so they thought, and was eating the pet food himself. One day in town, he wandered into the Olds dealership to look at the new cars. The manager didn't want to insult him, so he asked which one he would like to buy. To the dealer's astonishment, the man said, "I think I'll take this one," paid cash for the car, and drove it away. There was one poor old man I felt sorry for. He had no legs and didn't have a wheelchair either. He got around on a little square wooden platform with rollers like a mover's dolly. He did not beg, but sold pencils. Of course, a lot of people told him to keep the change, but if they didn't, he didn't complain. I don't know where he lived, but during my school years, I saw him on the street almost every time I was in town. He was always polite to everyone who stopped. To the best of my knowledge, we didn't have a town drunk like Otis Campbell and Andy Griffiths, Mayberry. Maybe the people who drank just took turns. I couldn't possibly leave out Dee's. It was built around 1956 or 57 as a small walk-up Dairy Queen and was an instant hit with the kids. It was the favorite after-school stop for an ice cream or Coke. Over the years, Dee's has been remodeled a couple of times, enlarged, and now has an eat-in dining room. It has a little more varied menu than in years past and even has soup beans and cornbread. Dee's is still a favorite of school kids and a Louisa landmark. When I went to my high school reunion in 2000, I told my wife we had to stop at Dee's first. Sure enough, there was one of my old classmates. Whenever there's a class reunion, nearly everyone makes a stop at Dee's while they're in town. Louisa's on the banks of the Big Sandy River and has a toll bridge coming across to Fort Gay, West Virginia. This is the only bridge I know of which connects two towns, two states, crosses two rivers, and has an intersection in the middle of it. The two rivers were the Tug and Louisa forks of the Big Sandy, which join together just below the bridge. In the middle of the bridge is an intersecting road which leads onto the point of land between the two rivers. That's what the area is called, the Point. Who would have guessed? In my youth, there was a lot of coal mining upstream on the Tug River, and it was extremely polluted by coal dust. It was black, or at least the sand on the bottom was. Where the rivers ran together, it looked like two tubes of paint squeezed out side by side, one black, the other light brown to almost clear. On the hill above Louisa, Town Hill, or Fort Hill, is the site of a Civil War fort, all traces of which are now gone. When I was in high school, Fort Hill was a favorite parking place for young lovers, our own Blueberry Hill. Louisa was also the birthplace of Frederick Moore Vinson, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and my mother's third cousin. He was born in the family quarters of the county jail in Louisa. His father was the jailer at the time, and was buried in the Pine Hill Cemetery at Louisa. Even though he occupied a high position, he did not care for the social life of Washington, D.C., but preferred a quiet family life. The area around Louisa has also produced several country music stars, such as Ricky Skaggs and Billy Ray Cyrus. That is Louisa, my hometown on the Big Sandy River. I may never move back there to live, but my wife wants us to build a little log cabin there for a vacation place when I retire. Louisa will always be my hometown no matter where I live. And we'll stop right there for today. We have one more reading, and that'll be it. One more reading. So this has just been a wonderful book. I hope you enjoyed this part today as much as I did. Of course, I've enjoyed the whole book. I hope you have too. I liked how this part started out talking about those horseshoe games. I've never played horseshoes. I could never even throw the horseshoe that far. I don't even know if I've ever actually tried. But I've been places, think of church camping trips and places like that where people would play horseshoes just for fun. Amazing that day, the greatest horseshoe game ever. You can see why Dale calls it that. That's just amazing. Not only that they each had the good luck all of a sudden, the expertise, but that they did it on the same day at the same game. That's what's really, really impressive. I wonder how many people play horseshoes today. You'll have to tell me if your family does. And then that ride home when he got to go to the family reunion before he was married, what car trouble they had, the brothers. Oh my goodness. that's a really rough patch there to have to go through all that. And things were so different in those days because, of course, at night towns just closed up tight and couldn't get people. There was nobody there to work on anything. I'm sure that was difficult. I don't know today if you could get something worked on at night or not. I guess it would still be difficult, but maybe in a different way, because you'd at least probably be able to get a hold of somebody. There'd be more resources. You might be able to rent a car, those kind of things. But that was a real memorable reunion, I know, because of that. And then how special that when they got there, they all ended up playing hide and seek. I always enjoyed playing hide and seek with my cousins and brothers and whoever was there when I was a girl. We played that a lot, picking somebody to be it and having to stay and count, and then while everybody hid, and just think of all the places I used to like to hide. It's always you had to think out your strategy. Did you want to hide close to the base and maybe while the person was out hunting somebody else, you could run back and get there? Or did you want to hide, somewhere really elaborate and make them come try to find you? Corey and Katie liked to play it too when they were little, and they'd want to play inside the house with me, and they'd always hide in the same places, and I'd try to tell them, try to find somewhere different. It's always behind a door or something like that. But one time, they were real little. It was funny. I guess I'd give them the speech about trying to find somewhere else, and Corey hid under one of our rugs, so there was just a hump under it, It was so cute. It was so funny, but cute, really cute. And I was the one looking for her then, but it was funny. A lot of people have told me, and then I've read in books, that when they were young and they played hide and seek, they called it whoopie hide, whoopie hide, whoopie hide. Lots of different variations on the names of that game. And then the pit cooking at the family reunion sounded so good. Wouldn't you like to eat some of that good food? Now Matt does that sometimes. He's built like it's kind of an in-ground smoker. We've not used it in a long time, but I need to get him to use it and show you. On the Blind Pig and the Acorn, you can find a post about how he built it. It was many years ago, but I need to get him to show you, and we need to build a fire and actually cook us something in it. That'd be a good video. I need to do that. Interesting too to hear Dale talk about the changes in his hometown when he would go back to visit. In my area, it's so much change, much more change than what Dale described there in Louisa. Much more growth in population here, all my life really. But especially the last 10 years, and even especially the last 2 years. So many people, you may live in an area where that's happening too, so many people wanting to live the urban areas, to leave the urban areas and move to a rural area to live. And that's really impacted our area a lot. And I guess I would say it's kind of a double-edged sword, because for people that maybe sell real estate and build houses and do carpentry work and all that, it's boom time. They can't even keep up with what's going on. But then it is kind of sad that it changes. You can't help it. It changes the hometown, changes your hometown where you grew up and where you lived, and it just takes away some of the calmer, thinking about like traffic. Murphy has got so bad with traffic, and I'll hear some people say, that ain't nothing, you should try Atlanta. Well, I understand that. It's not nothing compared to Atlanta, but it's just so drastically different than what local people have experienced until the last few years. So it is, I really like that part, Dale talking about it, and nice that at that time when Dale wrote the book, at that time when he was writing that Louisa hadn't changed that much. So that's really, really interesting. And then kind of him describing the town, I liked that part. Now, because I live so far away from Murphy, as far as being able to walk or anything like that, I couldn't do that. It's not that I live, 30 minutes away or anything. We live about 15 to 20 minutes away. But certainly I didn't spend a lot of time there when I was young, growing up. I didn't, get to go to town and just wander around by myself. We didn't ever do anything like that. I was in 8th grade before I saw a movie in a theater. Dale talking about his first movies. Those movies made me think of that. But there wasn't any going to town and spending the day like on Saturday to watch the movies or do whatever you did. The closest thing I can think of to that is that one of my dear friends, Tracy, she lives in Montana, and I just got to visit with her. She just come home for a visit, and that was really nice, getting to see her and her nice husband, Shannon. good friends of ours, even though they live in Montana and we live here. But the closest thing was her mother, Vicki, at one time worked in the courthouse, worked in the clerk's office, and sometimes, this is when we were in high school, so we were in Murphy at the high school, me and Tracy would ride the bus to the elementary school in town, and then we'd get off the bus, and then we could just walk up to the courthouse, and then Vicki would take us home. We'd go home, you know, she would bring us home. And we would go to Parker's drugstore and get maybe a cheeseburger or a drink or whatever, and just kind of walk around and look at the stores, look at whatever was, you know, at that time, Big D, or not Big D, Super D was still there, and then also the dollar store was in town. Any of you locals probably remember the creaking floor and all that, so we would just walk around and look. It wouldn't be that long, and then it'd be time for Vicki to get off work and take us home, but that's the closest experience with kind of being in town, and that wasn't often, that wasn't every day, that was just ever so often that we would do that. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book with Dale talking about his kind of, I guess he's beginning to wrap it up, kind of about him leaving home and how it was to go back home, and all of his other family, his brothers and his sisters, and, you know, his nieces and nephews, his parents, grandkids. And then talking about how his town had changed and how it hadn't changed that much in a lot of ways at the time of this writing. It'd be interesting to know what it's like today. If any of you are from there, you can leave us a comment and tell us about that. And please leave a comment and share anything else that jumped out at you from this part of the book. And be sure to drop back by next Friday, because that will be the last reading for Watermelon Hill.